Nearly a quarter century ago, egalitarian geneticist David Suzuki debated the late racial scientist Phil Rushton over the issue of race differences in intelligence. Instead of trying to counter Rushton's arguments point by point in a scientific manner, Suzuki instead resorted mainly to emotional and moralistic appeals.
In allowing his articles to be published, scientists and scholars legitimate his work and must be condemned for a serious dereliction of responsibility. You see, there will always be Rushtons in the world, and we must always be prepared to root them out and not hide behind academic freedom.
Now, anybody who viewed the debate with the goal of drawing scientific lessons from it would disregard the issue of whether their social, moral, and political views align with Suzuki's. All of Suzuki's social, moral, and political rantings are irrelevant to the scientific question of whether biological differences between races that extend to brain functioning exist. And on that question, if you believe that Suzuki refuted Rushton, then you were duped by Suzuki. Because the reason why Suzuki engaged in such passionate protestations of Rushton's evidence is not because he knew that Rushton was wrong, but rather because he knew that there was a significant degree of truth into what Rushton said, and he feared the consequences.
Potentially we could breed up a group of people, let's say, who have IQs of 60, so that they could go into a factory in Detroit and they would be perfectly content turning the nuts on the back wheel of a car, this sort of thing. We'd have a special elite group of people who were super intelligent. I think we're a long way from that. I think, though, that we already have enough knowledge just from straight animal and plant breeding, the laws of simple breeding, to be able to say that if you had a man with super dictatorial powers who said, I want to make a super race, and you know, there is precedent for this. This has already been done in the Second World War, using very lousy genetics. But if you had a really turned-on dictator who knew a lot of genetics, I would say in 50 to 75 years, he could make a population of people that would be unbelievable. You want them tall, he could make them. You want them to live longer, 20 years longer, by breeding the right kind of people, he could do it. So this kind of crude genetics is certainly possible. To me, this is a scary, scary kind of power to have.
So you see, Suzuki fears racial science not because he believes that it is false and ineffectual, but for the opposite reason, because he knows that racial hereditarianism is true, and he fears the consequences of it being put into effect.
We're so fickle, we're so prejudiced, we're so hung up that I wouldn't want to see anyone try to apply this kind of knowledge. There was a paper in a journal called Military Review, which is put out by the American military. And in this book was a paper by a man who's a geneticist in Sweden, and he had published this thing called Ethnic Weapons. What he pointed out in this paper was that there are various differences among racial groups in terms of sensitivity to a number of nerve gases, and these differences are inherited. And if you could accumulate a number of different genetic traits and devise chemicals that would attack specific combinations of these genetic traits, that it should be possible to devise weapons that would selectively eliminate one race and not affect another. When you think about it, that's incredibly perceptive, because the present-day weapons are really messy. If you drop one over a village in Vietnam, you kill off your soldiers if they happen to be around there as well as the enemy. But if you're involved in wars that involve different races, then clearly if you can eliminate blacks or yellow people and not touch whites, that's a very good idea. The imagination of the military is really unbelievable, and they're very far ahead of the general level of scientists, I think.
I don't get the mentality of trying to dupe the public into believing that something isn't true because you fear the consequences of it. I mean, if you convince 99% of people that races do not exist, racial differences do not matter, what good is that going to do when you're up against a North Korean dictator who wants to develop an ethnic bioweapon that will implant a genetic disease in other races except for Koreans? Maybe that will be able to be done at some point. So if we're all believing that it can't be done, that it's pseudoscience, that it's morally outrageous to even talk about the possibility of doing it, then we won't be awakened to the threat. But I think that Suzuki's ideology is a much bigger threat to humanity than racial science. Suzuki is a radical egalitarian environmentalist who wants to see drastic population reductions, especially among those populations that are the most prosperous and consume the most resources, because he basically equates human life with all other forms of life. Humans to him are just like maggots, fruit flies, whatever. We just happen to be bigger and we're just happen to be able to consume more things than fruit flies. And throughout history, it's been the left-wing movements that deny human nature in various respects that have inflicted the most carnage upon humanity. It's been the left-wing movements that have inflicted the most suffering, caused the most poverty, and killed the most people, because it is their premise that human nature is not something that needs to stand in the way of their ideological aspirations. Their view is that humans are malleable, and therefore an ideology empowered by a government can effectuate any change that the left-winger desires. And this is their delusion. And because this is their delusion, they have to deny realities.
I am outraged. I am outraged at these monstrous claims.
Screw that. I mean, I'll admit I'm a banana. I'm yellow on the outside, I'm white on the inside, and I'm going to give you my message.
That is not a scientific argument.